Welcome to another enlightening presentation at the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society's 2021 virtual conference. This session is titled Black Genealogies Matter, introducing the HBCU Heritage Home to house and espouse the genealogy over history in these books' ancestral stories. In quintessential depiction of this year's conference theme, this presentation details how history and genealogy dually manifest in the stories that are published in African-American genealogies. Moreover, it introduces the HBCU Heritage Home Genealogy Tourism Site to showcase these stories. Acting on African-American genealogy tourists' concerns about representation in stories at existing genealogy tourism sites, this presentation showcases an ideal site based on African-Americans' own stories published in our genealogies. I'm Pamela E. Foster, your host for this session. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us. Back in 2007, the acclaimed scholar Saidiya Hartman wrote very movingly about her experiences with global slavery tourism at various sites on the African continent. As much as she tried to find herself and her ancestors at sites including ones in Ghana, she simply could not connect. She had no loved ones who she knew by name there, no people in whose shoes she could walk. This experience made clear to her that if you're not traveling to revel in the lives of people and traditions that you know and hold dear, you have no ancestral home to visit as a genealogy tourist. Other scholars also have honed in on this notion of African Americans being unhoused relative to genealogy tourism sites. Genealogy tourism sites ideally are sites full of ancestral stories that affirm identity through the warm ancestral traditions of home, and they model ancestral visions of the future self. Genealogy tourism often is known as roots tourism or heritage tourism. And regarding African Americans, the terms genealogy tourism, roots tourism, and heritage tourism all are synonymous with global slavery tourism, what Saidiya Hartman experienced. That's because so far, African American genealogy tourism focuses on the Atlantic slave trade and or its negative aftermath for people of African descent. The ongoing phenomenon of Hartman and other descendants of U.S. antebellum enslaved people not seeing their ancestral self-identities reflected in genealogy tourism exhibits that are about specific ancestors to whom they belong is a worldwide communication, genealogy, and African American self-identity challenge to overcome. I expect you're well aware that what we call the Big Three, the newest mega African American heritage tourism sites, are addressing this problem. They all address the problem by focusing on general slavery horrors and subsequent injustices, and in the case of the NEMAC, also triumphs, not necessarily stories about ancestors. So they answer the desire to have history told in heritage tourism sites, but not genealogy to a large extent. Each of these sites does pay homage to genealogy in some way. And then there are the plantation tourism sites. About 400 of these sites are across the United States, and they also have addressed portions of the genealogy tourism problem for African Americans. These places originated to celebrate antebellum white planter life, and now they also feature doses of both slavery horror stories and African American ancestral family stories. According to one of the leading scholars on plantation tourism, he says plantations are, quote, ground zero in understanding not just African American history, but also how the modern tourism industry has tended to disinherit Black travelers from their heritage. This disinheritance comes even as African Americans spent $109 billion on tourism in 2019. And that represented 18% of the domestic tourism industry spending. And that spending includes the growing $832 million heritage tourism sector. So we are spending our money on heritage tourism, but we do not yet have a site that properly showcases our genealogical stories. The African American family heritage stories that are told at plantation tourism sites typically come from our published genealogies. Some of these published genealogies are kind of well known. We might know, for instance, works by Rose or Redford. Many of us know genealogies written by Agnes Kane Callum about her ancestors at the Sotterley plantation. The way she writes about ancestors versus the way historians talk about those same ancestors, or the plantation site managers choose to present the stories, are very different. For instance, in one passage about the Sotterley enslaved people, the descendants speak of ancestors' lives in such terms as from which experience he learned and strength of character, while the site managers and historians use such terms as social and economic gap and paternalistic and racist attitudes towards Blacks when speaking about those same people. So we can see here that descendants' terminology about their ancestors suggests positive qualities and values to be bequeathed to offspring, while non-descendants' terminology suggests perpetual victimhood. An examination of stories that affirm and renegotiate identity could indeed help illuminate the ancestral representation that Hartman and other African Americans are seeking when they want to reclaim ancestral selves through genealogy tourism. So what would a genealogy tourism site look like if it focused on stories published in African American genealogies? That is, what if a site shared only stories that we wrote and decided were the stories we wanted shared about our ancestors? Essentially, this is asking what are the ancestral and self-identities that are displayed in these books? And then how would these stories be displayed and further researched at an optimal African American genealogy tourism site? It turns out that the answer to what such a site would look like is found in my dissertation research. I am a PhD student at Georgia State University in the communication department, and I'm conducting a content analysis of up to 15 21st century African American genealogies. The books I'm studying include winners of the Oggs Genealogy Book Award over the last several years. And education permeates these books. I'm looking at 3 or 4 different types of African American genealogies published in the 21st century. One type is the compilation. These are books that are written by multiple authors, multiple stories. Sometimes the stories connect with each other, sometimes they don't. The books talk a lot about slavery horrors and injustices. They also talk a lot about the processes that the authors undertook to or engaged in to gather the information. They're practically travel logs of genealogy tourism. The authors guide people along with them as they travel to sites to research records, as they travel to interact with family, to gather oral history or have family reunions. These books, the audience seems to be African Americans who are looking to conduct their own research and publish books. And then secondarily, the audience is the families who are the subjects of these stories. In addition to the compilation kind of African American genealogy, I'm looking at the outward facing type. These are African American genealogies about a famous subject or by a famous author. Typically, they're put out by major publishers in hardback or trade paperback. There also is lots of horror, racism, discrimination, and so forth in these books, and a ton of heroic overcoming those things. The audience for these books is the general American population. African Americans in general are secondary, and lastly, the families who are the subjects of the stories in these books. The third type of African American published genealogy I'm looking at is the standard type, and this is my favorite. I'm really only analyzing the others to see what differences there might be between them and the standard type. The standard African American 21st century published genealogy is mostly a small paperback pocket book. Sometimes they're larger, the 8.5 by 11 size. They're written for the families as the primary audience. These books, and they're published in very small press runs. The books tend to have the family names in the titles. We see examples here of Durham and Thompson. They also sometimes have generic titles that give a sense of what the books are doing or what is being revealed in the books. And they tend to use versions of first and last names of the family members in their titles. And then the final kind of African American 21st century published genealogy I'm looking at is the coffee table version. These are elevated versions of the standard genealogies. They likewise are meant for the family members as the primary audience, and they're meant to have their covers displayed rather than sit on a shelf with their spine facing outward. So they tend to be beautiful to look at. On the right here, we see a leather-like grain with gold inlay in Edwardian script, very elegant script often used for formal projects. On the right, we see a highly polished cover, not a dust jacket, and it's in a marbled media sepia design with a compelling family image. And again, these books are meant to be looked at from the cover rather than from the spine. So, what I am asking as a scholar analyzing these genealogies is the overall question of how are we representing ancestral self-identity in these books? And then the sub-questions that are pulling out pieces of that overall question. One is I want to understand what is it we are saying in these books about enslaved people? What are we saying about those who are our ancestors, enslaved people in general? Are there any differences? That sort of thing. What are we saying about social and cultural capital and how it's used in our ancestors and our own lives? And what are we saying about ancestral honor and inheritances in these books? That is, the things we note ancestors valuing and then acknowledge and value in ourselves and think of them as values we have inherited from the ancestors. And it turns out that education, especially higher education, and especially historically Black college education, permeates the answers to these sub-questions. For instance, common tropes about enslaved ancestors are stories of how they learned to read, how the community valued and provided education, or their own going to or sending their children to HBCUs. In terms of social capital, education institutions are written about as places where the right connections for social standing and business are made. Authors talk about ancestors meeting on college campuses, for instances, and the alumni groups and or fraternities and sororities they're in that are part of their career and social success. So that social capital role for education is very strongly stressed in these books. And in terms of ancestral honor and inheritance, again, this is how people connect what they value in ancestors to what they value in themselves. We see that there's a focus on education in the sense that family traditions of valuing education are often spoken of. And then when the authors talk of their own educational attainments, they speak of that valuation as something that came from the ancestors, was inherited from the ancestors. So again, education permeates these books, and it turns out that it's a big part of the answer to my dissertation research questions. To take a look at a couple of specific ways education is mentioned in African American published genealogies, let's look at a passage from the Durhams of Fairfield. Here we see in a mention of Mansfield Female College that the author says, in view of the segregation of the time, no African American students attended this institution. There were African American employees, perhaps some with the surname Durham. So from this, we get both an overall indication of the value of education, including having to overcome its denial, and the importance of education institutions in African American heritage as workplaces, not solely study places. And then we get the sense that with proper school records, much more can be learned about the Durhams who worked at this school. And from this passage, we also get a hint of the importance of documenting and celebrating education heritage. And that comes from the mention of the Mansfield Female College Museum, an African American genealogy tourism site that focused on ancestral education. In one sense, would be sort of a massive version of a school museum. It would be a place that celebrated and held records from the school. It also would be akin to a family research center where you go in and sit at a terminal and have access to all manner of digitized records. And also it would be like a fabulous hotel resort where you can just spend time in a luxurious environment and do so for multiple days at a time, experiencing some of the things your ancestors experienced. Another example of how these genealogies tend to talk about education comes in the Thompson family book. Here we see at the very first mention of an ancestor, the writers indicate that he is a graduate of Tuskegee University. This is very common. If an ancestor matriculated at a higher education institution, that tends to get conveyed to the audience rather quickly. That's not something you learn about someone later in the reading. It's something the writers of these genealogies think is an important enough component of the lives of the people they're speaking about that they tell you this early on. And in a final example, of how education shows up in African American published genealogies, here we see a medley of educational institutions for a family. So this notes secondary schools, HBCUs, Ivy Leagues, Seven Sisters, private, public, all kinds of schools members of this family have attended over the years, and that really gives a sense of the importance of education in this family. So, a genealogy tourism site focused on stories from African American published genealogies would indeed have to highlight education, as these books do. So let's imagine such a site. It's an ancestral home full of traditional positive stories about scores of personal ancestors and thousands of cultural ancestor successes. It's a comprehensive site where ancestors, via their cherished home values and customs, serve as model behavioral heroes. It's a place where the underlying documents about these heroes are easily accessible for further research. And it's a place where sufficient homey space, time, and other services are available to luxuriously and nostalgically perform ancestral selves. Its name is the HBCU Heritage Home. That name demonstrates the unbreakable bond between African American heritage in higher education and in family home life, as depicted in our published genealogies. The HBCU Heritage Home is located in the American South. It's on 400 acres. The size demonstrates the honor commensurate with the ancestral and descendant well-being that it is designed to achieve. It's the size of T.D. Jakes' Potter House complex in Dallas. It's nearly half the size of Central Park, and it's a third larger than the U.S. heritage tourism industry leader, which is Colonial Williamsburg. The mission of the HBCU Heritage Home is joy in ancestral knowledge and self-elevation via genealogy, especially the education-related stories. It carries out its mission by availing to descendants of HBCU students, workers, and others full online access to their ancestors' educational institution documents, including records of the now closed HBCUs. You may know that there have been more than 250 HBCUs, most of which are closed now, and only about 105 remain. And the documents are not just for HBCUs, they're for higher education across the board as it has manifest in African American heritage. So this site avails luxurious spaces for families to visit for multiple days so that they can research ancestors and walk in their footsteps and re-experience and reenact ancestral educational lives. It pays homage to the proliferation of buildings and streets and the like that are named for such people as Booker T. Washington, Benjamin E. Mays, and other well-known African-American higher education leaders. It incorporates stories of what remains of those final buildings and remnants of those now closed schools. Its prime service is that it has spacious dedicated areas such as libraries and auditoriums that honor each HBCU, and bedrooms and garden spaces and the like to honor each ancestor who descendants so desire to not acknowledge through lineage certification, and others choose to honor through sponsorships. So the HBCU Heritage Society is the lineage group in which descendants can secure membership by documenting stories of their HBCU ancestors. It is worth noting that in addition to no mega heritage tourism site yet utilizing African American genealogies as the core source for the exhibited stories, and none yet staking its claim on higher education as the story to be the core focus, The current U.S. genealogy tourism landscape is missing other key components that could indeed help resolve the problem of underrepresentation of African American genealogical self-identities. For instance, I will note the importance of having overnight stays because in a recent survey of 48,000 African American tourists, 64% of them said that cultural heritage attractions are their #1 destination. And they say they prefer these destinations for family reunions. And of course, genealogy tourism requires multiple days for reunions, for documents research, and for immersing oneself in ancestral environments. So again, it is noteworthy that the big three major new African American heritage tourism sites are not designated for overnight stays. Full service representation in the current genealogy tourism industry climate comprises an eclectic mix of records about specific ancestors, travel packages to access those records, dynamic spaces for enacting ancestral stories, family reunion planning, specialized libraries, family archives management, and so much more. And the HBCU Heritage Home has it all. The engine that drives the HBCU Heritage Home is the records. One of the greatest legacies of HBCUs is indeed the millions of primary source documents they have generated. These documents date back to 1837 with the first HBCUs, and again, for higher education in general, the records go back even earlier. We started attending higher education institutions in the United States in the 1700s, so there are records from that far back. Again, there are more than 250 HBCUs in addition to the other schools that hold our records. And there are millions of stories of Black lives told in visuals and in text in these documents. So much so that numbers show that the nearly 6,000 attendees of HBCUs by 1900 have so many descendants now that practically every African American with long-standing roots in this country has at least one and typically multiple ancestors who went to HBCUs. In addition, of course, to the pre-1900 HBCU students and African American attendees of other schools being honor-worthy ancestors to learn about in these documents, so too are the millions of African Americans who've pursued higher education since 1900. Again, the number of attendees nets each descendant of a U.S. Black family of long standing many, many ancestors available to learn about. They're just ripe for exploration and investigation via genealogy tourism. Attending to these descendants' well-being via provision of and assistance in gathering and understanding an ever-growing body of uplifting higher education ancestral stories is the most anticipated outcome of my dissertation. The genealogy records include So many different kinds, such as ancestral transcripts, diplomas, catalogs, student newspapers, yearbooks, administration letters, parents and student letters, family address listings, national church funding and mission records, tuition accounts, student orations, Greek lettered and other student organization documents, lots of documentation about pedagogies that work, lots of documents about architectural records of the student-built buildings, event programs, photographs, and so many other documents. Some ancestral higher education records that were generated at HBCUs are now at various other repositories now that the schools have closed. For instance, the schools that were funded by the Presbyterian Church that are now closed, those schools' records are housed at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. And it's interesting that despite all the education records and all the rich information available in them, most of the revered African American genealogy how-to books and resource guides do not showcase, and mostly they omit, recommendations for higher education documents and experiences for African American genealogy research. There are some exceptions. Generally, in these exceptions, of course, in not emphasizing education records, one de-emphasizes the importance of higher education in African American life. But the fact that education so permeates the actual published genealogies is one indication that the writers of these genealogies are not looking to the how-to books in order to determine what to put in the books. Among the exceptions to the how-to books, those that do give advice about education records, they, for instance, encourage researchers to get ancestors' theses and dissertations. They encourage descendants to collect ancestors' educational diplomas and certificates, and they encourage research in ancestors' yearbooks, transcripts, and other education-related documents. So descendants can use these documents, as I have, to really flesh out ancestral stories, thereby getting a better sense of both our ancestors and ourselves. So when you see in an ancestor's obituary or know from oral history, for instance, that they attended such and such a school, you would then know that those school records are at your fingertips. My ancestor, we see here, was educated both at Industrial High School in Birmingham and Mary Holmes Seminary in West Point, Mississippi. So I would, by looking at education records that are held, in this case, at the Presbyterian Historical Society, but in all education records, you can find these kinds of things. We can learn what our ancestors studied. So here we can see a list of textbooks. We can see their textbooks in syllabi also and other documents. This is in a catalog. We can see their transcripts. Here's an example of one of my ancestors' transcripts. And you hear a lot about liberal arts education versus industrial education with respect to HBCUs in the early days, and a lot of criticism about schools teaching people to be nothing more than servants and things like that. My ancestors were servants, and beautifully so. I like that I see sewing and cooking among the courses they took, but you see a range of courses. So there was no either industrial or domestic or liberal arts. Lots of courses are designed specifically to develop critical thinking skills and, of course, the whole Christian being. Here's another of my ancestors' transcripts, and again, by getting a sense of what people studied, you broaden your understanding of those people. You get to see your ancestors' names on school documents related to their courses, related to what cohorts they're in. You get to learn what roles your ancestors played on campus by looking at educational documents. In this case, we see my ancestor served as poetess for her class day the year she graduated, and you get to see what they recited, what activities they were in, and so forth. Here we have the title of her recitation for commencement exercises, just a small sampling of the rich information you can learn about ancestors in HBCU documents. Again, names in documents, you can see their progression as they matriculate. You can see what information your ancestors sent back to their alma maters in alumni updates, what subsequent addresses, jobs, spouses, and other information they wanted their alma maters to know. All of that fleshes out your understanding of your ancestors. And of course, you get to see pictures. Here's a picture of one of my ancestors in her Mary Holmes Seminary 1909 graduating class. Another picture of one of my Mary Holmes Seminary graduate ancestors in her graduating class. And you get to learn things about the class makeup of classes your ancestors were in and so forth. There's just so much that can come from these documents. Many entities already have started and are well on their way in terms of digitizing records from higher education institutions to be utilized for genealogy research. I expect many, if not most of you, know about the HBCU newspaper history project that OGS has undertaken, and one of the things it does is help avail digitized newspapers for just this kind of genealogy research. The first HBCU student newspaper was founded back in 1883, and it's an example of all of the papers in that, yes, they are historical documents. Yes, for instance, just being the first student newspaper, this could be studied from a historical perspective. The fact that Du Bois was one of its editors means it can be studied from a historical perspective in that sense. But most of all, these papers can be utilized for genealogy research because our ancestors' names are throughout these papers, either as students who worked on them or who students who are in the stories, faculty members, other workers at the universities. So these newspapers can be newly viewed and used as genealogy records, not just history records. And the HBCU Library Alliance is another entity that already is digitizing documents so that many people, including genealogists, can use the records. Again, the wide array of records is just astounding. So that is how I envision the HBCU Heritage Home so far. But more important is, how do you envision it? How do you envision the HBCU Heritage Home? What features would you like to see in a genealogy tourism site dedicated to telling the stories that we choose to tell in our published genealogies? What other questions and comments do you have about the HBCU Heritage Home or our published genealogies? I remind you to please rate this session and contact me with any questions. Again, I'm Pamela E. Foster, and I'm delighted that you have joined us for this presentation. We'll now take questions.